All right, 1.5, bias and sampling. And we only have one objective here, so we want to look at explaining the resources of bias in sampling. All right, if the results of the sample are not representative of the population, then the sample has a bias. Now there are three sources of bias. There's a sampling bias, there's a non-response bias, and then there's a response bias. And we'll look at all three of these. All right, so sampling bias means that the technique used to obtain the individuals to be in the sample tends to favor one part of the population over another. Sampling bias also results due to undercoverage, which occurs when the population of one segment of the population is lower in a sample than it is of the population. Okay, so for instance, if our college, say, is 50% men, 50% women, but when we go and do our survey, we only survey the women, and we try to say that all of that represents the college. That's false, because that's only going to give us a small representation, and it's not going to represent the full population, which has both men and women on there. And so we want to make sure that anytime that we do a survey, that our sample represents the population of the college, okay, or the population, okay, with those. All right, a non-response bias. This exists when individuals selected to be in the sample who do not respond to the survey have different opinions from those who do. Okay, so we've got to be careful here on those. All right, so a non-response means that they're not responding to those pieces. And so we want to try to solve that. And a lot of non-response happens in phone calls where you pick up and you're like, I don't know who this is, I'm hanging up with those things. And just general blast surveys. We also have one at the college that happens all the time, and that's our student evaluations. Those get a lot of non-responses. Only a few of my students do that. And so it may not get a true representation of what my class really feels. Okay. Now we can improve those things with callbacks or incentives, but that doesn't always happen, and so that is where, again, we still have that non-response bias. Now, response bias, this exists when the answers on a survey do not reflect true feelings of the respondent. So we always want to make sure we have that. Okay, so the first way that we can have a response bias is the interviewer error. The interviewer asking a bad question or not writing down something correctly. 2, misrepresented answers. So this would be probably a case where it's a multiple choice or a true false, and you don't fill either one of those ways. The wording of questions, putting in double negatives. This happens a lot on our elections. They try to confuse you in the words of a new bill that's going in, and so you have to be careful and read them very carefully. The order of questions, or words within a question. So making sure that we are cognizant of each question with those things and how we're putting them in order, because it may lead, based off the last question, how you answer the next question. So we have to be careful with that. Then there's the type of question, whether it's open or closed. Sometimes having a closed would change the answer of a person because they have to pick the one that is closely related, closed meaning multiple choice, true, false, so forth. Whereas open, they could give their actual opinion in written terms. And then finally, data entry error. And that just means that you put something in wrong. That does change the outcome there. Okay, and so here's a little more on that. Although technically not a response bias, data entry will lead to results that are not representative of the population. So for instance, if you had somebody age 39 and you entered 93, that would really change the data on those pieces. All right, so again, non-sampling errors, they result from undercoverage, non-response bias, response bias, and data entry error. Such errors could be present in a complete census of a population. Sampling error results from using a sample to estimate information about a population. This type of error occurs because a sample gives incomplete information about a population. So we just want to be very careful. Anytime that you want to create a survey and do statistics, make sure that your sample represents the population that you were talking about, and that you try to avoid these biases as much as possible. All right, those are the things that you're going to need to know here for 1.5.